Well, welcome to lecture 4 of our summer school on introspection and consciousness. It's, as you can see, it's getting a bit cold here in Canberra, so I've had to put the heating on, but we'll muddle through anyway. Today's lecture is called Focus on Evans, and we're going to focus on Evans as the lecture suggests, as the title suggests. So let me begin by recapping. So last time we set out what I call an evidence argument, sometimes called a transparency argument, which is due mainly to Fredretsky, but discussed by a lot of other people. And that argument says that, or at least the idea behind that argument, is that in knowledge by introspection, there doesn't seem to be anything that could count as evidence for the thing that you apparently know, and it's natural to think that if there's nothing that counts as evidence, then you can't know it, which suggests that there's a sort of contradiction at the heart of the idea of knowledge by introspection. We also set out various solutions to that problem or puzzle, concentrating on my own favourite solution, which I call the rationalist solution, and that solution says that there's a rule of rationality, a rule about how the psychological states of rational agents are organised, which says that if you're in a conscious state, and at least if certain background conditions obtain, then you'll believe that you're in that state. And we appeal to that idea to try to give an account or a response to the evidence argument, showing that it could be perfectly okay for you to come to believe and know that you're in certain mental states without there being evidence for the things that you believe and know, or at least without there being evidence on a certain conception of what evidence consists in. Well, today I want to look at a famous passage from Gareth Evans, the 20th century British philosopher Gareth Evans, which in a certain sense is even more famous perhaps than the Fredretsky paper. In fact, it's one of the most famous passages in the philosophy of introspection, and but it's closely related in various ways to the argument from evidence that we considered from Fredretsky. So I'm going to focus a little bit on that passage, and I'll also focus on what Alex Byrne has to say about that passage and that the idea contained in the passage in his book Transparency and Self-Knowledge. So that's the topic for today. Well, let's begin with the Evans passage. So Evans says, in making a self-ascription of a belief, one's eyes are, so to speak, or occasionally literally, directed outward upon the world. If someone asks me, do you think there is going to be a third world war? I must attend in answering him to precisely the same outward phenomena as I would attend to if I were answering the question, will there be a third world war? We'll come back and look closely at this passage as we go. But first of all, who's Evans? Well, Evans, as I mentioned, is a British philosopher. He died in 1980. The passage which we just quoted from is from his book Varieties of Reference, which came out 2 years after he died. Here he is in his glasses and beard from the 1970s. This is actually a still from a video which you can find on YouTube. It's a video about it, of a discussion between him and Peter Strawson on the nature of truth. In fact, Hugh Price, the Australian philosopher who's now at Cambridge, ferreted out this video and put it on YouTube, and he has a project called Smoke and Flickering Shadows, Strawson and Evans on Truth and Factuality, which I've given you the website for there. So go and have a look at that if you want to see Evans in action. That's who we're talking about. But how do we interpret this passage from Evans? Well, first of all, Evans is talking about in self-ascribing, in self-ascribing a mental state. That means ascribing a mental state to myself. What he's talking really about is coming to know that I myself believe something, or if you self-ascribe something, then you come to know that you believe something. In this case, coming to know that you believe that there will be a Third World War. Evans focuses on the case of thinking that there will be a Third World War, but we can think of that as just belief for our purposes. So the topic is the topic of knowledge by introspection, knowing by introspection that you know that you believe something. Knowing by introspection, that you believe something. Now, what Evans says about this is he says that when you do this, when you come to know that you believe something, then you do not attend inwardly, as he says. Rather, you attend outwardly upon the world. And in a certain sense, this is kind of unexpected given the discussion that we've been having so far. And the reason is that unless you adopt an inner sense view, or perhaps an acquaintance view as well, then the whole idea of attending to your own mental states, at least prior to forming the belief that you're in them, or the knowledge that you're in them, attending to them doesn't really make sense. As we saw when looking at Shoemaker's discussion of the perceptual model, the inner sense model, Shoemaker mentions various features of perception and then discusses whether introspection has those features as well. One of the features is attention, where the idea is that in ordinary visual cases, if you see a range of objects, you can attend to some of those objects, for example, select them in a certain sense in perception, and only on certain views of introspection is it even possible to do that in the case of introspection, prior to forming the belief that you're in a mental state. And it's possible on what Shoemaker called the object perception model, for example. And it might also be possible on the acquaintance view, according to which we're acquainted with our mental states, which an acquaintance view doesn't endorse everything that the object perception model does, and certainly doesn't endorse what the broad perceptual model endorses, but it does, I think, permit the idea that you can attend to your mental states in advance of forming beliefs about them. But if you set those theories aside, then it's not that surprising to think that you can't attend inwardly in that sense, and you must attend outwardly. So in a certain sense, what Evans is saying here is not that surprising. But what's perhaps more surprising is some of the remarks he makes about this. One thing he says is that you must attend to outward phenomena in coming to know that you believe something. So if you come to know that you believe something, or rather according to Evans, at least in this particular passage, you must attend to outward phenomena. Now, from a certain point of view, that doesn't seem correct. It doesn't seem that you must, at least not if that means in every case you must, or it's necessarily true that you must, or something. That seems to be an exaggeration. And partly it's because you can come to know that you believe something in all sorts of ways. Maybe you don't attend inwardly for perhaps certain versions of the inner sense theory have been set aside, but it may be that you don't attend outwardly either. Maybe you just find yourself with certain beliefs. In principle, that can happen. So it's a little hard to see why Evans should say must. But I think we can interpret Evans here in a slightly weaker way. One way to do it would be to say that what he really means is that you can come to know. So we could think of him as better interpreted as saying that you can come to know that you believe certain things by attending outwards. Or perhaps another way to do it perhaps might be to say that you must, insofar as you're coming to know something by introspection, in the limited case of knowing something by introspection, you must attend outward. So these are a sort of more restricted ways of hearing what Evans is talking about. I should say that here and throughout, I'm not interested really in Evans' interpretation, trying to figure out what what Evans himself was talking about. I think what most people do when they quote Evans and talk about Evans's observation and so forth is they quote the passage and they take it that the passage is kind of gesturing at something, and the question is that the issue is how to characterize the thing that it's gesturing at without necessarily being faithful to all of Evans's intentions, even if that were possible. And I'm going to be doing the same sort of thing too. So while I do say that Evans is better interpreted as saying that you can come to know this, or perhaps that you must in certain circumstances, but not must generally, what I mean is that the thing that he's getting at is better interpreted as that claim. Well, but perhaps the most... So that's what Evans is... We've been talking sort of about the first part of the passage, really. If we go back to the passage, in making a self-ascription of a belief, that is, in coming to know that we have a belief, one's eyes are, so to speak, or occasionally literally directed outward upon the world. We're attending out. But then he goes on to say, and I think this is really the most controversial part of what he says, if someone asks me, do you think there is going to be a third world war, I must attend in answering him to precisely the same outward phenomena as I would attend to if I were answering the question, will there be a third world war? So notice here that we've got two questions in play. We've got the question, do you think there is going to be a third world war? And then we've got the question, will there be a third world war? Now these questions are quite different. The first one, at least taken completely literally, is a question about your psychology. Do you think there's going to be a third world war? Whereas the question, will there be a third world war, is not about psychology at all. It's about the political or military situation or the future of the world or something of that sort. But at any rate, it's not about you and what you think. It's about the world. And if we focus on the bit here that I've underlined, to precisely the same outward phenomena as I would attend to, it looks as if one might, well, at least one might take what is being said here as follows. You might think of him as saying that these two questions are to be answered in precisely the same way. The psychological question about whether you think something and the non-psychological question about whether something is the case should be answered in precisely the same way. And if you hear Evans in that way, then I think, again, it doesn't look true. It looks like a kind of, it looks like an exaggeration at best and perhaps just false straight out. And here's a simple example to bring that out. I mean, suppose, for example, you're a detective working on a murder and you go through weeks of painstaking work in which you interview people and examine crime scenes and go through the files and so forth. And suppose that at the end of this, all of this work, you conclude that a particular person, say Mr. Plum, committed the murder. Mr. Plum did it. Now suppose that you have one of these, press conferences where you have to tell the press what's happening, as always happens in detective stories on Netflix. And then the media asks, well, do you think that Mr. Plum did it? Do you think that Mr. Plum did it? Well, in answering that question, it doesn't look as if you're going to do the same sort of things as you would do if you were answering the question, did Mr. Plum do it? Do you think that Mr. Plum did it versus did Mr. Plum do it? These are questions which are analogous to the questions that Evans is talking about. But in this example, you precisely wouldn't, in answering the question, do you think that Mr. Plum did it, do the same thing as you would do if answering the question, did Mr. Plum do it? And the reason for that is that if you did answer that second question in the same way, you'd start your research all over again. But that isn't what you do. So that really isn't a good way to interpret Evans either. But again, I think we needn't interpret Evans, or at least what Evans is getting at here, as saying, I don't think we need to take Evans to be saying that the two questions are to be answered in exactly the same way. I think really his point is that what seems to be the case is that you often attend to something non-psychological when you answer a psychological question about yourself. So when you answer a psychological question about yourself, like, do you think that there will be a third world war, or do you think that Mr. Plum did it? That means when you come to know these things about yourself, you find yourself attending to something psychological, maybe to the political situation in the world, or maybe to what it is that Mr. Plum may have done, or what evidence you have for that. And so in the case of belief, which is the sort of example that's the mental state that's at issue here in the Evans paragraph, in the case of belief, the idea is that you come to know that you believe something, that you believe, by attending to what you believe. So you might suppose you believe that that there will be a third world war. The idea is that you come to know that you believe that there will be a third world war by attending to what you believe. Now, what is it that you believe? Well, what you believe is that there will be a third world war, and that, in a certain sense, we can think of that as a possible situation, or perhaps a set of possible situations in which there will be a third world war. You attend to that when thinking about the question of whether you believe something. So you attend, in other words, to something non-psychological in answering this psychological question about yourself. So that's a way of, I think, of interpreting the passage that we quoted from Evans. Now, Alex Byrne, in his book on transparency and self-knowledge, and in a kind of a lot of influential work that surrounds that book, which is extremely interesting, Byrne goes further than that in his interpretation of Evans. He doesn't just say that, according to Byrne, what Evans says or is getting at is not just that you attend to something non-psychological in answering a psychological question about yourself. What Byrne says is that Evans is concerned with inferences. Now, as I mentioned in Lecture 1, the word inference can mean lots of different things, but for Byrne, as indeed for us in this course, an inference is something that involves a transition from a belief to a belief. So if you remember the example of my believing that my neighbour is an accountant because of the way he dances at the Christmas party, in this case what seems to happen is that I come to believe certain things about how he dances and perhaps how accountants in general dance, and I infer from that my neighbour is an accountant. So in this case I move from a belief to a belief. It's not just a transition from any mental state at all, it's a specific transition from a belief to a belief. Now what Byrne says is that Evans is really talking about that sort of transition from a belief to a belief. And we can put this in the following way. So according to Byrne's Evans, in other words, Evans as interpreted by Byrne, we reason as follows. We reason from a certain premise to a conclusion. The premise is there will be a third world war in this particular example, and the conclusion is I believe there will be a third world war. So notice that here the premise is a non-psychological premise. It's a premise about the world or the political situation in the world or the future of the world or something of that kind, but it's certainly not in any way a psychological claim. There's no psychological element at all in that claim. The conclusion, on the other hand, is a psychological claim. It's a claim about, in this case, my psychology. I believe that there will be a third world war. And what Byrne thinks is that Evans is suggesting, or at least, again, it's not so much what Evans meant, but the proper way to interpret the point that Evans is making, according to Byrne, is that we draw the conclusion, I believe that there will be a third world war, which is a psychological conclusion, from the non-psychological premise, there will be a third world war. And in fact, Byrne thinks that this is the case not just for belief, but for mental states in general, or at least for mental states in which we can come to know that we're in them by introspection. So he thinks something analogous would be true for perception, something analogous would be true for desire, for intention, for knowledge, for imagination, and so forth. And Byrne's book is a sort of big defense of this idea. It always involves an inference, as he puts it, an inference from the world to the mind. So you can see, if you look at this inference again, premise one is a premise about the world, in other words, the world independently of the mind. And the conclusion is a conclusion about the mind, about my mind in particular, or your mind if you went through it. And it's in this way that Byrne defends in his book a kind of inferentialist view of introspection. You'll remember that last time I said there are really two sorts of inferentialist views about introspection. There's one sort which says that you infer something like, you come to know that you believe that there will be a Third World War, for example, from some other psychological premise, maybe from certain feelings that you have. So the idea is, I feel a certain way. The best explanation for my feeling this way is that I believe that there will be a Third World War. Therefore, I believe that there will be a Third World War. That way of developing an inferential view, I said, was... there's quite a lot of truth to it. Some things of that sort certainly do happen. But it can't be, as it were, a full theory of introspection, because the question obviously arises about how you came to know the psychological thing from which you inferred the fact that you had this belief. Well, the other way of being an inferentialist about introspection is to think that you infer certain psychological claims from premises that are not themselves psychological. For example, from premises about my behaviour or my local environment or something. Byrne's is an example of that second sort. So he thinks that in general, you come to know things like that you believe that there will be a Third World War from premises like there will be a Third World War. And since those premises are non-psychological, we have this particular kind of inferentialist view. So that's why Byrne's version of inferentialism is really sort of novel and interesting. It promises to be a full-blown inferentialist proposal about introspection, but is different from a kind of more standard version of inferentialism, according to which you would be talking about your behaviour or something of that sort. But there's a sort of an obvious problem for any kind of inferentialism of that kind, of Byrne's kind, and the obvious problem is that the inferences that he's talking about look like terrible inferences. They don't look any good at all. So to illustrate this, let's go back again and look at this inference. Premise one, there will be a Third World War. Conclusion, I believe there will be a Third World War. Well, let's just assess that sort of dispassionately. Well, first of all, the premise doesn't at all entail the conclusion. From the fact that there will be a Third World War, it doesn't at all follow that I believe anything. And so it doesn't follow that I believe that there will be a Third World War. I mean, that premise could be true even if I didn't exist, or I didn't believe anything. So it couldn't possibly entail the conclusion. So the premise doesn't at all entail the conclusion. Another way to bring that out is to think about it in a third-person kind of version. So this is a first-person version of a conclusion because it's I believe that there will be a Third World War. But suppose we have a third party, like Taylor Swift. So suppose I gave you this argument, there will be a Third World War, therefore Taylor Swift believes there will be a Third World War. That's clearly not a valid argument. It's that the premise doesn't entail the conclusion at all. So one thing about these arguments is that they're not formally valid. But another thing you might say about the argument is that it's not only not formally valid, it doesn't look as if the premise gives us any reason at all to believe the conclusion. I mean, again, think of it in a third-party situation. Suppose it's true there will be a Third World War. That doesn't give you any reason at all to believe that Taylor Swift believes that there will be a Third World War, or that anybody else believes that there will be a Third World War. These things are completely separate. The two topics seem to be unrelated. So it doesn't seem to even make it likely that I myself will believe that there will be a Third World War. Remember, we can also, this is supposed to work in general for belief, so it's got nothing to do with this particular example. So just take some example where we have some claim, there's an odd number of cars on the street right now in Canberra. Therefore, I believe there is an odd number of cars on the street right now in Canberra. That argument is a terrible argument. It's not the premise doesn't give us any reason at all to believe the conclusion. So you might ask, how does Byrne's inferentialism even work, and how can he extract this idea from evidence? So that's why the basic problem for Byrne's view is that inferences of the sort that he's interested in don't look any good at all. Now, this isn't news to Byrne. He knows this perfectly well. In fact, he spends a lot of his book setting out exactly why the inferences are no good. But he doesn't think of this as an objection to the inferentialist view. He thinks of it as a puzzle, which he calls the puzzle of transparency. And here's one way in which he characterizes the puzzle. He says, it seems initially plausible that beliefs are transparent. In the passage he's talking about beliefs and perceptions, but let's set aside perception for the moment. It seems initially plausible that beliefs are transparent, and by that he means, when he says that beliefs are transparent, there we have that word transparent again, but what he means in this context is that we infer that we believe that P from P. So I infer that I believe that there will be a Third World War from the claim that there will be a Third World War. He says it seems initially plausible that beliefs are transparent, and the reason it's initially plausible is he thinks that's what observations like Evans's are pointing us to. However, he says, it's hard to see how one can sometimes come to know that one, excuse the typo there, that one is in such states, in states of belief, by considering typically non-psychological topics that have little or no bearing on whether one is in the state. The puzzle of transparency is the problem of resolving this tension. So the idea is that the puzzle of transparency, if we go back to this argument, is to say, well, on the one hand, it's got to be true that I come to believe that there will be a Third World War from a premise like, by inferring it from a premise like there will be a Third World War. On the other hand, that can't be the case because the inference is so poor. That's the puzzle of transparency as Byrne formulates it. And of course, it's a puzzle. You can call it a puzzle if you like. You can also say it's a very serious problem for an inferentialist view of introspection. Well, how does Byrne solve this puzzle? Well, the solution to the puzzle really has two sort of independent parts, and the two parts come together to solve the puzzle, or to solve the problem. The first part is to say that there are things that Byrne calls epistemic rules. Epistemic rules are like ordinary rules, it's just that they involve belief, really, in this context. And the main one he has in mind is the rule which he calls Bell. If P, believe that you believe that P. And P here is supposed to be something that it could easily be non-psychological. So if there's an odd number of cars on the road right now in Canberra, believe that you believe that there's an odd number of cars right now on the road in Canberra. Or in Evans's example, if there will be a Third World War, believe that you believe that there will be a Third World War. This is what Byrne calls an epistemic rule. And in his book he compares it to a number of other different sorts of rules, some not epistemic. So that's one part of, what's one sort of idea that Byrne has. And another idea he has is he has a theory about what it is to follow a rule of this kind. There's the rule on the one hand, and then there's following the rule on the other. To follow the rule, Byrne says, is to believe that you believe that P, so in other words, to do the thing that's in the consequent of Bell. You believe that P, because you recognize that P. And recognize here means come to know that P, or at least it also entails believing that P. So, for example, the idea is that if the rule were, if there will be a Third World War, believe that you believe that there will be a Third World War. Suppose that was an instance of the rule. You'd follow that instance of the rule just in case you believed that there will be a Third World War, because you recognize that there will be a Third World War. This, in fact, is a more general. The notion here of following a rule is actually quite special to Byrne's own proposal. And it's an instance of a more general claim. The idea is that if you have a rule of the form, if C, for any set of conditions, believes something, then you follow that rule just in case you believe that thing because you recognize that conditions C obtain. Now, what Byrne says is that if you put these two things together, you have a sort of solution to the puzzle of transparency. And so in particular, what he wants to say is that if you do follow Bell in this way, then you'll end up with a true belief, which in the normal case will amount to knowledge. Why will you end up with a true belief? Well, suppose the rule is if P, believe that you believe that P, and suppose that you follow that rule, then you'll end up believing that you believe that P. But that belief, the belief that you believe that P, will be true. Why? Because in following the rule, you'll have to recognize P, recognize the antecedent of the rule. And that means, in part, believing that P. Well, how does that help? Well, let's go back to this argument. Suppose we have a rule that says if there will be a Third World War, then believe that you believe that there will be a Third World War. If you follow that rule, you'll come to believe that you believe that there will be a Third World War, because, in part, you believe that there will be a Third World War, and that will be the second order belief, the conclusion, will be true. The thing that is stated in the conclusion will be true. Here's a sort of more intuitive way to put it. While it's true that P1 doesn't entail the conclusion, nevertheless, if you go through this reasoning, if you infer from P1 to the conclusion, then the conclusion will be true. Because if you infer from the premise to the conclusion, it must be the case that you believe the premise. And the premise is just that there will be a Third World War. So if you believe that, and then you infer to the conclusion that you believe there will be a Third World War, that conclusion will be true. So while the argument is no good, it has this interesting feature that if you, as it were, go through the reasoning, you'll end up with a true belief. And the way that Byrne puts that is you will be following this epistemic rule, Bell. Okay, so there are various. So that's Byrne's solution, really, to the puzzle of transparency. And as I say, he doesn't just discuss belief, though belief is the main case. He goes through lots of different psychological states. Well, let me mention. There's a lot of stuff going on in Byrne's book, and it certainly it goes through a lot of material, and it's difficult to get a handle on it. But let me mention some problems for Byrne's view and then end with an alternative. So let's consider this rule just as here's an initial problem. Here's an initial problem for Byrne's view. We can consider another rule, not just Bell. Let's take this rule, call it time. If P, believe that time passes, or believe that time exists. And here the rule is supposed to be, again, like Bell, that P can be absolutely anything. So it could be that snow is white, or that there will be a Third World War, or that there's an odd number of cars on the table. Cars on the table, not odd number of cars on the street in Canberra right now. Now, this is a rule that's the same form as Bell, and you can follow it, just as you can follow Bell. What is it to follow it? Well, according to Byrne, it would be to believe that time passes because you recognise that P, where P again can be anything, for example, that snow is white. That's just to apply Byrne's account of rule following to this particular rule. Now, why is this interesting? Well, it shows that if you do follow this rule has the following interesting feature. If you follow it, you will always wind up with a true belief. And that's because following a rule itself is something that happens in time, and in fact over time. So if you if you follow this rule, you will end up with a belief that time passes, and that belief will be true if you follow the rule. But the thing is that you can't appeal to this to establish that time exists. It's obviously a big metaphysical issue as to whether time exists. Some people, like McTaggart, for example, the sort of idealist of the beginning of the 20th century, thought that time didn't exist. Well, you can't respond to McTaggart's famous argument against the reality of time by saying that snow is white, which you could on Byrne's view, because at least if this was a rule, if P then believed that time passes, because you could say, well, snow is white, and if you abide by the rule, if P then believe that time passes, you can come to believe that time passes, and that belief will be true and may amount to knowledge. But that isn't a way of responding to McTaggart's argument, but it would be if Byrne's proposal were right. Of course, I don't think this is a good way of responding to McTaggart's argument. The point is that Byrne's account of introspective knowledge looks analogous. There's another problem for Byrne's view, and that is that while it's formulated in terms of epistemic rules and following a rule and so forth, if you sort of look past that, it really begins to look much like Armstrong's broad perceptual view. You remember that when talking about Shoemaker, he distinguishes the object perceptual model of introspection and the broad perceptual model. And the broad perceptual model says basically that there's an empirical law or law-like generalization between believing something and believing that you believe it, let's say in the case of belief. And that it's in virtue of that that you come to know that you believe things, or that you see things in certain cases. Of course, the broad perceptual view isn't formulated in terms of the notion of epistemic rules at all, but if you just look at the facts, it looks as if Armstrong and Byrne agree on the facts. Armstrong too, for example, will agree that you believe something because you recognize something, because that just means that you believe something because, at least in part, you believe that thing. And that will be true in Armstrong's view because there's an empirical law-like generalization connecting these two things. But if that's the case, then we would expect Byrne's view to be vulnerable to the objection that Shoemaker famously brought against Armstrong, namely the self-blindness argument, the idea that Armstrong's view permits a certain possibility which we shouldn't really permit. It looks, if from a factual point of view, regardless of the way in which it's described, Byrne's view is analogous to Armstrong's view, then it would likewise suffer that problem. And finally, a third problem for Byrne's view is that there's a sort of an odd feature of his discussion, and that is that the notion of consciousness doesn't figure prominently at all. He really rarely discusses it. And that suggests that on the face of it, his procedure would work even if the belief that there will be a Third World War, to go back to Evan's example, were conscious or not. We sort of often assume in discussions of introspection that all of these cases are supposed to be cases of conscious beliefs, conscious perceptions and so forth, because otherwise, as we said in Lecture 1, it wouldn't be plausible to think that we have some sort of special way of coming to know that we're in them. Unconscious states seem to be psychological states which do not have a particularly interesting epistemology. It's only conscious states that have that interesting epistemology. But there isn't any restriction in Byrne's rule Bell or in the notion of following a rule that's got anything to do with consciousness. Look at it. If P believed that you believe that P, there's just nothing there about the belief that's mentioned here. There's no requirement here that the belief is conscious at all. And that suggests that his procedure would work even in the case of an unconscious belief. So suppose, for example, you you believe that there will be a third world war, but unconsciously. You didn't consciously believe that. On the face of it, you could follow Byrne's rule, in which case you would end up with introspective access to unconscious states. But that seems like an implausible overgeneralization of the notion of knowledge by introspection. So these are three sorts of problems for Byrne's view. One is that his rule Bell looks analogous to rules like time, which likewise have the feature that if you follow them, you'll end up with true beliefs, but nobody would appeal to the rule time to establish some claim about the nature of time or anything like that. The second thing is that looking past the apparatus of epistemic rules and so on, Byrne's view looks very much like Armstrong's view. And if that's true, then it would be subject to the similar kind of objections. And the third problem is that since, curiously, there's no particular role for consciousness in Byrne's view, it's hard to see why it wouldn't also apply to unconscious states, in which case we wouldn't really have an analysis of what it is to have introspective knowledge of unconscious states. Okay, but is there an alternative? So remember, Byrne's view is motivated by Evans's observation and a particular inferentialist interpretation of Evans's observation. And then the idea is that the inferences that are involved there are sort of poor, so how can we use them? That's the sort of dialectic that Byrne is contributing to. Well, is there an alternative way to deal with all of these issues? Well, let's go back to the introspection rule that I considered last time when talking about Dretske and earlier as well, as part of the rationalist view as I've been describing it. So the introspection rule, you'll remember, was if you're in a conscious state, believe that you're in the state. And again, the ellipsis here is supposed to tell us that there's a lot of background conditions that could be in force. And this introspection rule is supposed to be analogous to rules of rationality, which are roughly like, if you believe that P, then don't believe that not P, for example, a no contradiction rule. Well, now take the belief that there will be a third world war, the one that Evans is talking about. Suppose that belief were conscious. It may not be conscious, of course, but suppose that it were conscious. And suppose that you abide by this introspection rule. Then you'll justifiably believe that there will be a third world war, as we saw last time. Why? Because if you abide by this rule, then you'll have a certain disposition, namely to form the belief that you're in the certain conscious state. And if the state in question here is the belief that there'll be a third world war, then you'll have a certain rational disposition to form the belief that you believe that there'll be a third world war, and that belief, the second order belief about the first order belief, will be a justified belief because it will be the outcome of a rational rule. I should notice here actually that the notion of abiding by the rule that I just appealed to can't be the same as the one that Byrne is talking about when he talks about following a rule. And the reason is that Byrne thinks that in rules of this kind you'd have to recognize the antecedent, which means you'd have to know that you're in a conscious state in order to follow this rule. But I don't think of that as a general, as an objection really, because I don't think that rules of this kind are followed in the way that Byrne imagines rule following to be. And the reason for that is that in general, just take a normal case of a no contradiction rule. If you believe that P, then don't believe that not P. To abide by that rule, you don't have to know that you believe that P. What has to be the case is that your mind has to be organised in a particular kind of way, perhaps explained, and moreover, perhaps that organisation has to be explained by the fact that you know the rule, but it doesn't have to be the case that you know the antecedent of the rule, as would be true on Byrne's proposal. So again, suppose we have this introspection rule, and suppose you abide by this rule, and suppose that the belief that there will be a third world war is a conscious belief, then of course you'll come to believe that there will be a third world war. But now the question arises as to whether that belief is a conscious belief and what it would take for that belief to be a conscious belief. How does a belief of that sort become conscious, you might ask? Well, as I mentioned in Lecture 1, there are different notions of consciousness here that one can appeal to. There's higher order views, there's phenomenal views, and there are also access views. And access views seem to be the most plausible in this context. Partly they seem the most plausible in this context because access views, it's clearly that belief states can be conscious in the access sense. But what is it for a belief to be conscious in the access sense? Well, a common proposed, there are various ways of developing this idea, but at least one view is that a belief is conscious in the access sense if you attend to a sufficient extent to its intentional object, as we might call it. In other words, you attend to a sufficient extent to what you believe when you have the belief. What does that mean? Well, take the possible situation that would make the belief true if it were true. Let's say if you believe that there will be a Third World War, there's a possible situation that would make your belief true if it were true, and you can attend to that possible situation. That's what it means to attend to what you believe. And that would make the belief conscious. So the idea is that if you have a belief, you can attend to what you believe in a certain kind of way, and that will make the belief conscious. And on the other hand, if it's conscious, and if you abide by the introspection rule, you'll come to believe that you have the belief. And this, in a sense, gives us, it sort of predicts Evans's observation. Evans's observation, as we were understanding it, is a matter of saying that you can come to know that you believe something, that there will be a Third World War, by attending outwardly, by attending to what you believe. Why? Well, because if you believe that there will be a Third World War, and you attend outwardly, your belief will become conscious. And if it's conscious, we can use the introspection rule to come to believe use the introspection rule is the wrong way to put it. If you abide by the introspection rule, then you'll come to believe that you're in that state by introspection. But notice that nothing here requires that there's any sort of inference going on. It's not like we're inferring that you believe that there'll be a Third World War from the premise that there will be. That's not the situation. What's really the situation is simply that you attend to what you believe. That makes your believing conscious, and once it's conscious, you believe that you're in it. But the shift from being in a conscious state to believing that you're in it isn't an inference at all in the relevant sense. It's not a transition from belief to belief. It's true, of course, that in this particular situation, there's a transition from belief to belief that's involved, but the reason that you're entitled to form the belief about yourself isn't an inferential reason. So there's nothing inferential going on at all from this point of view. And if there's nothing inferential going on, then we lose Byrne's puzzle of transparency entirely. Byrne's puzzle arose from saying, well, how can it be that on the one hand we come to know that we believe things by inference when those inferences are very poor? The answer to the puzzle is that we don't come to know them by inference. We come to know them because they're conscious states, and if they're conscious states, we are entitled to believe that we're in them, but not because of any sort of inference. So that, I think, is the alternative solution to the puzzle. Okay, so next time, that's the end of today's lecture. Next time we'll have a look at quite a different topic, which is the topic of revelation. So we'll talk about that next time. Thank you.